So what is wrong with the housing market? Over the last 50 years, US housing prices have increased a lot more than inflation, and especially what we call the most desirable areas of the country. The trendy areas, the places where people say, oh, I really want to move to that place. I'm an economist, and even if you aren't, there's a really obvious story about what's going on in the housing market: supply and demand. Yes, of course, it's supply and demand. Right? Demand is high, supply is low. Of course, prices are astronomical. As usual, supply and demand is not wrong. It is correct to say that supply and demand gives us insight on what's going on with housing prices, but it's still, in this particular case, deeply misleading. Because normally when we say supply and demand, it very much sounds like we're talking about natural scarcity. Why are courtside seats at basketball games so expensive? Well, there's naturally a great scarcity of courtside seats at basketball games. Everyone can't be sitting in the courtside by definition. What the research that I build this book on says is that it is not the case that natural scarcity is a big problem. Instead, housing prices have increased largely because regulation is artificially reducing supply, and by a lot. Right, so what's wrong with the housing market? This is what's wrong with the housing market. One of the main issues in the book is, what is the best symbol for government? Right now, outside of the US, Uncle Sam isn't a symbol for government at all. It's a symbol of the US, but since I was thinking of a largely US audience, I figured Uncle Sam is about the best we have. It is true, and I'm totally on board with most regulation of housing is actually state and local, but there wasn't any good symbol for it. So I said, well, Uncle Sam is a symbol of government in America, and I think this is the best that we can do for communicating this idea in one image. All right, so let me give you a quick tour of top housing regulations. Almost every country that I've looked at has a lot of regulation. Even places like India, where you might say, why would you go and stop construction in India when so many people are sleeping in the streets? And the answer is, well, we got our reasons. We're going to go and strangle housing even here. So what are some of the top housing regulations, the ones that wind up making a big difference? So one is height restrictions. We have the technology to build very tall buildings in desirable locations. We've had this technology for over 100 years. If you go and look at the skyline of New York City, you'll see a bunch of buildings that are very tall and are ancient. No one alive, or almost no one alive, remembers them being built any longer. But getting permission to build new ones is super hard. The ordeal to go through, the number of layers of bureaucracy, the number of rules you have to follow is so much that very few of them get built compared to the number that would be profitable if it was just a matter of, I own the land, I want to build this, get out of my way. Something that is particularly important in the United States is multifamily restrictions. A large majority of residential land is set aside for single-family homes exclusively. You can't do anything else. Minimum lot size, even when you are building a single-family home, very common to say you have to waste most of your land. And I do mean waste because normally builders would realize that while people like having extra land, they don't like it enough to actually pay anything close to the market price, unless obviously the government says that you are not allowed to go and build on anything less than an acre, in which case they are stuck. Minimum parking requirements also wind up mattering a lot. Seems like a picky point, but when you look at the numbers, it's very common to say that builders have to build 2 or 3 parking spaces per resident, which means, or per unit, which means that you have to go and, again, waste an enormous amount of land just to go and build anything. All right, much more, but that's a start. How much does regulation actually raise prices? We've got data going back now about 100 years where you can just look at how housing prices used to work around most of the first world. And we can see is that historically, even large rises in demand didn't produce long-term rises in housing prices. Back when population was growing much more rapidly than it is now, we didn't see long-run rises in prices. Instead, when there was a shock to demand, prices would go up, and then as a result of this, prices would be above cost, and then markets would do the normal thing that you do when prices are above cost, which is produce more to make piles of money. This is how things worked. Once prices got above cost, this would lead to a lot more construction. The construction would continue until prices fell back to what we call the break-even level, the long-run competitive level. rough estimate of how high prices have gotten now is that prices are now at about double the break-even level averaging over the entire country. So for the entire country, we're at about double the cost of production, the physical cost, the actual physical cost of doing it. How do we know? All right, the standard method here, which goes back to economists Glaser and Jerko, is to take a look at very similar homes that have different amounts of land and then use the extra price of the house with extra land to measure what is the value of land that does not have the actual permission to build anything on it. Go for it. What is that price? Right? And what they find is that the extra value you'll pay to have 100 square feet of vacant, unusable land for anything other than walking around or playing volleyball is real low. Then after you got this pure value of land, next step is to go to a big manual of construction costs used by people who are actually in the industry and figure out what is the physical construction cost to actually make the home. Right? Then finally, you sum the cost of the unimproved land with the cost of construction compared to price, and that gap is the measure of the effect of regulation, which is often somewhat confusingly called the zoning tax. Sometimes someone who actually knows about zoning says, well, it isn't really a tax. Yes, the researchers know this. They just want to have a name for what regulation is adding to the price. So earlier work on this found enormous zoning taxes in your most desirable areas. So Bay Area, New York, LA, right? Places like downtown Chicago, right? But didn't find much elsewhere. And then the idea is, all right, it's a severe problem in some places, but for most of the country, it's not very important. But then later on, researchers got better data on vacant lots and bringing the vacant lots at different distances from downtown areas. And what they found is that actually in almost all major population centers in the US, there are large zoning costs. Government regulation is adding a lot, almost everywhere that a lot of people live. Right? So if people are there, they probably are actually paying a lot extra because of government. Now, why write a whole book on housing in particular? Doesn't government raise prices of other stuff? Sure. But here's the key thing. People spend way more on housing than they're doing on gasoline or chewing gum. So when you double this cost, it is a huge deal. You're doubling the cost of something that is a large share of the budget, which means it has a large effect on living standards. So a rough estimate is that housing costs are about 20% of your budget. So if you could have that, cut the cost of living by 10%, and then raise standard of living across the whole US by an average of 11%, which is a ton. All right, now this brings me to my very favorite chapter of the book, the panacea policy. Who here has heard the word panacea before? Yes, all right, good. I talked to a few people who said they never heard of it, and like, what? No, this is a common word. All right, anyway, all of the evidence that I talked about points to a really straightforward, brain-dead way to dramatically increase living standards, which is housing deregulation. We got regulation. Regulation's the problem. Get rid of the regulation. Things can go back to normal as they used to be. All right. But what really motivated me to write this book is when I realized that there's a lot of other problems that seem unrelated but are in fact closely connected to housing regulation. Many of these problems, people think of them as they're so intractable, what could possibly handle any one of them? And I was looking at the evidence saying, not only do I know how to handle one of them, I know one policy that simultaneously make a big dent in a long list of problems. All right, so deregulation promises to dramatically mitigate many other social ills, including inequality, social mobility, poor prospect for working class males, homelessness, environmental issues, low fertility, and also crime. All right, so let's see. All right, so let me just go through some of the main arguments here. Inequality. This one's real easy. The share of people's budget they spend on housing falls with income. Rich people spend a smaller share of their income on shelter than poor people do. That means if you reduce the price across the board, you are doing more to help poor people than rich people. That, by definition, reduces inequality. And since, this is a large share of the budget, this makes a noticeable difference. Similarly, it's also true that homeowners are higher income than renters on average. For landlords, as we're going to see, rather for homeowners. Housing deregulation is a mixed bag. There are a bunch of good things for homeowners, which definitely should be pointed out. But at least for homeowners, you can say, yeah, but also my primary asset is going to fall in value. For tenants, it is a clear-cut gain because they don't own the property that is losing value, and so they just pay a lower price without a loss in asset value. Social mobility. There used to be a really clear-cut way in the United States, very simple, where a person that was motivated could raise their standard of living. Just meant, say, like, unless you live in the richest, highest wages parts of the country, leave where you are, go to a high-wage area, and pocket that extra raise. Right. In the past, it was true that housing prices were a little bit higher in high-wage areas, but it was a small difference, so that almost anyone who wanted to go and rise could just pack their bags, get in their car, drive to a high-wage area, pay a little bit more in housing costs, have a lot more in income, and enjoy the difference. What economists Ganong and Shoag showed is that it is no longer true that this works in the modern United States. Because now when you move to the highest wage areas of the country, housing costs are so much higher that the housing cost increase eats up more than 100% of the wage gain on average. And therefore what's going on is that people are tending to leave high wage areas of the country, which is almost unprecedented. It's like, I'm going to go to an area where wages are lower. It's like, why would you ever do that? Because the housing cost is so much lower that I actually get a gain. When you go and read the work, they have even more interesting details, like high-skilled workers can still get a gain by going to high-wage areas because for them, the housing cost is a smaller share of the budget and the wage gain's larger. But for a janitor to go and move to New York City today from Mississippi is a way to get poorer, not richer. Another big gain. Poor prospects for working class males. You've probably heard of the book Deaths to Despair by Nobel Prize winner Angus Deaton and my dissertation advisor Ann Case. One of the main things they show is that non-college males have done very poorly by a lot of measures in recent years, and their favorite story is that non-college males have a lack of work that at least feels meaningful for them. Right? And what kind of work feels meaningful for them? Well, the classic one is manufacturing jobs, and this is classic manly employment. This is one where, despite all sorts of efforts to go and revive manufacturing, it is pretty much hopeless for the simple reason that we are close to satiated on manufactured goods. Who here wants to go and own 5 televisions? On the other hand, there is another classic kind of manly employment, which is construction, which is still high wage, and where still most people would like to get a lot more if the price were right. Most people today would like to have a much bigger place if the price were reasonable, whereas they don't want to get a whole bunch of televisions. Right? And again, what does this specifically do for working class males? Well, a large majority of people working in construction are, first of all, non-college workers, second of all, male. So not only are you making it affordable for them to have a home of their own, but also you are creating a lot of extra jobs. And in particular, this is something where if we were to go and say double employment in construction, it makes a huge and transformative difference because it's a large industry now. If you were to double it from roughly 10 million to 20 million, this would be a transformation of what it is like to be a non-college male in America. All right. Homelessness, this is one that I was skeptical of when I first started going and working on this, but because I was thinking of homelessness as living on the street, but actual statistics are more like not having a permanent address. And for this, it makes a lot of sense that if you go and make housing more affordable, people are going to stop sleeping on their friend's or brother's couch or stop couch surfing. And again, this is what the evidence says, is that a very strong predictor of actual measured homelessness is just the cost of a cheap place. All right. Our environmental issues, this is one where, again, Ed Glazer, together with Matt Kahn, has done some very cool work showing that actually new construction has a lower carbon footprint than old because even though it's bigger, it's much better insulated. Furthermore, the areas of the country that are nicest in terms of weather conditions, Southern California most notably, these are places that have very low heating and cooling costs, and yet also perversely they have regulated prices in that area so high that people flee. And when they flee California, where do they go? They go to places where they will have a larger environmental footprint. Low fertility. This is one, it's a bit more controversial, but the papers that are on this are on my side. And again, common sense just says one of the main reasons why you keep living in your parents' basement is because housing is expensive. As long as you're living in your parents' basement, you are highly unlikely to get married and even less likely to start having kids. So I think when you put that together, it really is hard to believe anything else. other than this is going to make a dent in it. And last, there's crime. Why don't we go and talk about that in the Q&A, but very cool experiment there. All right, so why not? Why haven't we deregulated?
If you want to see the rest of this talk, as well as a panel discussion and audience Q&A, where Bryan goes on to explain the political challenges of housing deregulation, but also how it can nevertheless be achieved, click here to watch it.